Well, welcome everybody. We have a few minutes, and we really have to give our speaker, Dr. Richard Goodrich, a real SDAA round of applause for speaking to us. He's not in this country. I believe you're in Israel. It's some ferocious time zone difference. The only slide I'm going to show of club business, and I'm sorry about the last two things, I didn't delete them. Stars at Sycamore Canyon and Mount Helix don't really look all that good due to the weather. Next September, we will have a Zoom for the imaging group meeting, and that Zoom will be about the NINA software. Last month, we did a hands-on demonstration of how to set up the scope and get good results and so forth. So this is now talking about the camera control side of life. We've got all the usual types of things on the schedule, but I'd like to point out, people have been asking about the eclipse. That's on the 14th of October. It's a morning event here, and we are going to have two groups of eclipse viewers, one at Balboa Park and the other at the Cabrillo Monument. Next month's program meeting is also a Zoom, and we have one which is almost an annual event, Webelos Woods, on the 20th and 21st of October. Does anyone want to add anything about Balboa Park and Cabrillo for the eclipse or Webelos Woods?
Ken, I'd like to ask for any more volunteers for Webelos Woods on 20th to 21st. Please shoot me an email or shoot Dennis an email, and we'll get you hooked up. We only have one or two people headed up that way at this point, and we could use a couple more hands up there. Thank you.
Are you going to camp with the Scouts?
Yes, actually, I will not be there. I will be out of town, and it will be it's near the center of the camp. Somewhere I've got a map. I can produce it for someone that wants to go up.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll have more information at the time of the event, but yeah, please, more volunteers. It's really a lot of fun doing this for the Webelos Scouts. In case you don't realize, that is the highest rank of Cub Scouting, and a lot of these Webelos are camping with their Boy Scout prospective troops that they will hopefully join, and so they're beginning to transition into Boy Scouts, and it's kind of a fun-filled weekend for them, and us bringing telescopes and giving them a star party just adds to the whole event and makes it very festive. And they take really good care of us.
And Ken, the 21st of October is the official Observe the Moon night. So
observe them. What do we have to do for that?
Not a whole lot. I was online actually, and they give you a bunch of things to print out for your folks that come by and look through your telescope. There's a whole bunch of little questions and little things you can put together depending on the age group and the grade. So what's the ages of these folks here? Do we know?
11, 12, and the Boy Scouts are older.
Okay. Yeah, again, you can go online and it's got a whole thing under NASA, I believe, called Observe the Moon Night. Anyhow, just so I throw that out because I just saw that a few days ago.
Okay. Would you send something out to the club? I was going to say, shoot me something, but might as well send it to everybody.
Yeah, I can do that. That's no problem.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the only little bit of business we have. Let me introduce Dr. Richard Goodrich. Got his PhD at the University of St. Andrews and is an author and his historian. After 20 years teaching in British and American universities, he resigned his position to pursue a full-time writing career. His interests actually coincide with a lot of mine, range from ancient history, the Roman Empire, and early church history to the Roman age. And right at the lower center, I have a copy of the cover of his book, which you might consider getting. But with that little brief introduction, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Goodrich.
All right. Can everybody see that? And is the sound loud enough for everybody?
Excellent.
Okay. Well, good evening or good morning, depending on what time zone you happen to be in. It's a pleasure to be here in San Diego, at least virtually, and looking forward to sharing a little bit about Comet Madness with you tonight. And so, let me just pop up the first slide here. I want to begin with an old German rhyme, and this is a school children's rhyme, so if you're out playing at recess sometime in the 18th or 19th centuries, this might have been something you would have said. 8 things a comet always brings: wind, famine, plague, and death to kings, war, earthquakes, floods, and dire things. And then one that might be a bit more familiar. I saw and behold a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, from the book of Revelations in the New Testament. So I want to begin tonight with a consideration of rationality. And the question is, are we as humans rational people? And of course, I'm, as Ken said, by training a Roman historian, and so it's basically impossible for a Roman historian to begin any presentation without introducing somebody from the ancient world, even if that doesn't really apply as well. But I think it does apply a little bit. And so here in the left corner, we see Socrates, who is the personification of rational thought himself. And then in the right corner, we have the Roman god Bacchus, who portrays irrationality and sort of the more earthly pursuits. And this was an interesting question that was aired in 1910 as Halley's comet approached the Earth. And so the 1910 pass of Halley's comet, it reached perihelion in April and made its closest approach to the Earth on May 18th of 1910. Well, in April, the Pittsburgh Post did a bit of a thought experiment. So it was kind of a pro-con essay, and they brought in 2 local Pittsburgh ministers. This was Rudolph Coffey and Albert Diefenbach. Coffey was given the unenviable task of defending human rationality. So the question that was raised is, if a comet was about to destroy the Earth, would humans behave in a rational manner, or would we revert to a rather superstitious or kind of what you might more expect? So Coffey had this job of trying to defend rationality, and so in his part of the point counterpoint article, he said, yes, actually, humans have made incredible progress down through the centuries, and we have cast aside our more primitive animal-like tendencies, and we've exchanged that for rational thought. So if a comet was about to destroy us, here's what we could expect. There would be, of course, a great return to religion. So people would realize that the things that had filled their lives up to this moment, secular concerns largely, made no difference for the eternal and the hereafter. And so it was very important for us to get our spiritual lives in order. Go back to church. Churches would have a resurgence of importance in society, and the pews would be full as people would be turning their ideas back to God. People would emulate Socrates, and they would realize that, although this age was coming to an end, the hereafter would be coming, and we would just calmly lay down upon our mats and wait for the end, calmly, peacefully, tranquilly. As I said, it's a bit of a difficult idea to get your mind around, and Albert Diefenbach, who was given probably the better part of the argument, said that's absolute nonsense. In fact, if a comet was about to destroy the Earth, exactly the opposite sort of thing would happen. There would be a quick breakdown in society. Law and order would cease to exist. I mean, after all, why would police bother arresting criminals? They're not going to be around to face trial or imprisonment, so they would give up that task Cities would become a nightmare as the strong preyed on the weak, and we would kind of cast ourselves back to an Epicurean bacchanalia. We would extract as much pleasure as possible from our lives in the moments that were left to us. Religiously, people would think that this was a terrible thing that God had done to humanity, and all faith would stop. We would see God as a cruel manipulator, and we'd simply lose all religious sensibility. In fact, Diefenbach argued, in this situation, it would be a miracle if that many humans survived by the time the comet actually did arrive to destroy the Earth, because we would basically consume each other prior to that moment. So he had a rather grim, pessimistic view of human rationality, especially human rationality under trial and test. Well, this was a thought experiment, but it was a particularly interesting one at the time because, in fact, Halley's comet was bearing down upon the Earth, and people were not exactly sure what was going to happen. Here is the comet itself, heading for the Earth in 1910. And the obvious question was, would humans remain rational in the face of the unknown, or would pressure be applied upon them by the media interested in making a profit and kind of ramp up anxiety to an unprecedented level? And as I'm sure you're probably not going to be terribly surprised to learn, it tended to be the latter case. So the media is going to catalyze a minor panic in the United States and indeed around the world. Well, Halley's comet, as all of you astronomers know, comes around about every 75 years, roughly. So the orbital period does vary depending on gravitational influences of the larger planets in our solar system, but 75 years is a pretty good estimate. It had previously come in 1835, and 1910 was the next pass. And I think it's really interesting to stop and think a little historically for a moment about this. Think about the changes in technology and science between 1835 and 1910. In America, for instance, in 1835, people were crossing, the continent in covered wagons. 1910, railroads had joined the cities, and people could cross the continent in relative ease. I mean, it took a few days, but you could still do it rather handily. Automobiles were replacing horses on the streets. You had airplanes and dirigibles flying through the sky. Steamships were replacing sailing vessels to transport goods across the ocean. So there had been a huge technological advance in this period. If you could transport a Roman forward in time to 1835, the Roman would find many things that were odd and unusual and unexpected, but realistically, science hadn't advanced that far. But by 1910, there's been an incredible change in what's happened in the world around us, a huge leap forward in both science and technological understanding. So the obvious question is, with this superior scientific understanding, are we going to be too worried about this comet? Well, the comet returns in May 18th, 1910. That's its closest pass to the Earth. And the question was, when would we first see it? And so in the summer of 1909, there was a huge competition among astronomers around the world to spot the returning Halley's Comet. So we knew it'd probably be showing up around 1910, but nobody was quite certain when or where it would appear in the sky and when it would, how the orbital math would play out. The man that everybody expected to find it was this man, Max Wolf, who was a professor of astronomy at Heidelberg University in Germany. And the reason everybody expected that he had the best shot at finding it is because he found everything else. So he was a master of astrophotography, and he spent his nights photographing the skies and then, displaying the photos over each other, superimposing them and flipping them back and forth to find objects that were moving. So Wolf found hundreds, if not thousands, of extraterrestrial objects flying in space, many, many asteroids. He found so many, in fact, that some of his colleagues would complain about him because they were always having to update and revise all the list of known objects, and they just wished he would take a few nights off and give everybody a chance to catch up. But he was the front runner in the sweepstakes to find the new comet, and indeed, on September 12, 1909, Max Wolf announced that he had seen Halley's comet and he knew where to look. So with this information, all the other astronomers could turn their telescopes to that portion of the sky. And a few days later, Frank Seagrave, who was an amateur astronomer and mathematician based in Rhode Island, he worked out the orbital path of the comet. So he was a very gifted mathematician, although an amateur astronomer. And he plotted out where the comet was going to go. And when he published his calculations, the many other astronomers endorsed them. So he actually did get the orbit right. So Seagrave said the orbit would take the comet to the sun, perihelion, on April 20th of 1910. And then on May 18th of 1910, the comet would pass the Earth. It would make its closest approach to the planet itself, passing 13 million miles. Now, again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit because I know you guys all know this information, but the moon is roughly 250,000 miles away. Mars is 125 million miles away. So the comet is 13 million. It's not that close. I mean, it's not nearly as close as the moon is, but it is not nearly as far away as Mars is as well. More disturbingly, however, was Seagrave's prediction that the Earth, as the comet passed, would fly through the tail of the comet. So the tail is going to be stretching 15 million miles by this point. And the obvious question is, what happens to the planet when the Earth flies through the tail of the comet? And as we're going to see, this became a cause of serious concern. So I want to talk about 4 reasons to worry, or 4 reasons why people in 1909 and 1910 were made to worry. And this would include collision, flood, cosmic death ray, and the tail gas that we just talked about. So let's kind of walk through these point by point. First hazard is obviously that the comet head could just smash into the Earth. And if the comet head did smash into the Earth, that would obviously not be a good thing for us. This is Father Charles Charapin. Charapin was a Jesuit astronomer. He was professor of astronomy, professor of astronomy at St. Louis University. And I want to emphasize, before even beginning to talk about him, he was a very serious and respected astronomer of his day. So this is not a crackpot by any stretch of the imagination. According to the newspapers, Professor Charapin had been on his way to the Lowell Observatory in late September, and he was going out to work with Percival Lowell to look at Mars. So Charapin, Lowell, and many other people, many other astronomers at this time, believed that the Martians were active on the face of the planet, and they wanted to use Lowell's telescopes to, as Mars was going to be very close to the Earth at this time, they wanted to get a good look at them. So Charapin is traveling out to Arizona, and allegedly, and I want to emphasize this word allegedly because it's going to come up a lot when we're talking about newspaper stories that were written at this time. Allegedly, Charapin visited Las Vegas, New Mexico, and while there, granted an interview to a local reporter. In this interview, Charapin announced that Halley's comet was actually going to strike the Earth, and when it struck the Earth, it would destroy the planet and inaugurate the return of Christ, so the second coming of Christ. And I've got this little quote here from the story itself. He believes that the comet is of a sufficiently solid mass to shatter both our planet itself, and that Jesus Christ foresaw exactly such a catastrophe when he uttered to mankind the warning that this world should one day meet a flaming doom. So this is a reference to the prophecy of Jesus found in Matthew 24, where see the stars falling and the heavens and the earth coming to an end. This story goes on to the Associated Press newswire and is quickly distributed across the country. Oklahoma. Priest predicts disaster. Father Charpin thinks comet tail destructive will slash us to ruin. Another newspaper, a Reverend Charpin says that we'll be destroyed this winter by a collision with Halley's Comet. The Chicago Interurban, this is the largest newspaper, or one of the largest newspapers in Chicago, and it has a huge West Coast circulation. So it's not printed just in the city of Chicago, but it goes across the West as well. World awaits Halley's Comet. And the story goes on to detail Father Charpin's prophecy. Now, we have to remember that we're talking about 1909 at this point, and we don't have the media resources that we have today. So there is radio, but there's no broadcast radio yet. There is no television. There's no internet. In fact, the only way news spreads, daily news, is coming through your local newspaper. And those local newspapers tend to rely on sources like the Associated Press for most of their stories. So imagine waking up in September of 1909 and suddenly reading that Halley's Comet, according to a very respected astronomer, is going to smash into the Earth and inaugurate the second coming. This would be something that would cause just a little bit of concern, I think you'll agree. Now, Charpin's view is a minority opinion, and many serious astronomers quickly jump on it and refute it, including this man. This is Father Daniel McHugh, professor of astronomy at DePaul University, and he raised two obvious objections to Charpin's theory. The first were the orbital mechanics of Frank Seagrave. So Seagrave had convincingly proven that the comet was going to miss us by about 13 million miles. So on the scientific front, there is no reason to be concerned about this, but I thought he had an interesting theological objection as well. And he quotes Christ's words found in Mark 13, about that hour, about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And McHugh argued that Charpin was basically committing blasphemy by claiming he knew when the world was going to end, when this text from the Bible says that nobody knows that, and it's only in the mind of the Father. So because of the protest levied by other serious scientists, this threat seems to die off rather quickly, and most people don't believe that the comet is going to strike the Earth. But it is rather indicative of of the fears that are going to be unleashed by the media at this point, and it's kind of the playbook for what's going to happen. I should say, I don't know if I believe that Charpin actually said this, or if it was just an ambitious reporter who made this story up. He doesn't make any sort of public retraction or comment or further comment about this, his prophecy. But in December, there is a story where he is cited as saying he doesn't believe that the comet is going to strike the Earth. So I tend to lean towards this idea that the story was just fabricated. Well, if the comet's not going to strike us, what about the idea that it might cause universal floods and drown us? So this was a second real possibility, and this got started in early January. So in January 12, 1910, a second comet, Comet A1910, appeared in the northern hemisphere. Now this is a comet that caught everybody off guard. It was extremely bright. It was 5 times as bright as Venus, but it had approached from the southern hemisphere. And at this time, the southern hemisphere was not well covered by observatories. And in fact, it was discovered by 3 South African miners. So they had seen this comet in the night sky and reported it to the newspaper. So it wasn't even a professional astronomer who spotted it first. But it was a very bright object, and by mid-January, it was filling the night skies. First reaction, of course, is it's Halley's Comet, and it's flown off course. It's made a right turn in space, and it's heading right for us. Obviously, Father Charpin was right, and it's going to smash in and kill us. Well, our observatories and astronomers said, well, that's not the case because we can see Halley's Comet. It's still not visible to the naked eye, but we can see it quite plainly in our telescopes. So this is just a lucky break. It's a second comet, 2 comets in 1 year. It's fabulous. However, on January 20th of 1910, the Seine River, which runs through the center of Paris, began to rise. And it rose, and it rose. By January 24th, it was 25 feet above its normal level, and it was continuing to rise, inundating the city. On January 29th, the river crested at 30 feet 5 inches above its normal height. 1/3 of downtown Paris was underwater, as you can see from these photos. The river, it came less than an inch from overlapping the levee that separates the river from the Louvre, and so a ½ inch spared the Louvre in this case. And this raised an obvious question: was the comet responsible for this flood? And you might say, I don't really see what the connection between those two things would be. But going all the way back to Edmond Halley, there had been some scientific thought about the question of whether comets could cause a flood. And so Halley himself had worked on the question of whether a comet had created the Genesis flood, the story of Noah and the ark. And his theory was that just as the moon raises a tidal bulge with its gravity, a close passing comet would also raise a bulge of water, and then that would be pulled across the earth and inundate the earth. So Halley didn't reach a definitive conclusion about this, and he left it as an open-ended question. But there were astronomers in 1910 who were willing to say that, yes, a comet could cause flooding. And one of the foremost of these was Henri Alexandre de Landré, who was the director of the Meudon Observatory in France. And his theory was that a comet's tail released X-rays, and this caused water to ionize in the upper atmosphere and led to increased rain and flooding. So not so much a gravity surge or a tidal surge, but a change in the atmosphere that released a lot of water and caused flooding. And so de Landré argued that indeed Halley's Comet, when it passed close to the Earth, 13 million miles away, could unleash floods like this. This is Camille Flammarion, and we're going to talk quite a bit about him in just a few minutes, but just kind of sneak him in here at the beginning. He's one of France's most famous astronomers, and he didn't buy it at all. Flammarion said, rain caused the flood. That was his explanation for it. Not a comet, and certainly not Comet A1910. Flammarion's argument was, I think, absolutely well. I know it's absolutely correct, but I think it was well argued as well. He said, if Comet A1910 was causing floods, why was it only causing them in Paris? Why isn't it causing a flood everywhere? It's visible in the northern hemisphere, and so his view was, of course, that it was something else and just climatology rather than comets that were causing these floods. So that was left as an open question. There were scientists at this time who believed that the close passage of Halley's Comet could cause flooding, but it was, again, open for discussion. Theories were still being floated about the impact of comets on the upper atmosphere. This is one I particularly love a lot. What about the idea that the comet is a cosmic death ray? And remember, in 1910, astronomers don't know nearly as much about comets as they do today. And there was considerable debate about most everything that you could think about. Any question you might want to raise about the comets, including whether they cause rain, were open for discussion. One of the things that's open for discussion is the nature of the tail. And so most astronomers of this time believed the tail was gaseous, but they didn't really know how that gas was produced or why you didn't see it all of the time. So that was still under consideration and debate. There were some other scientists who believed that the comet's head was solid, but as it moved through the ether, which fills space between the planets, it caused a wake. So just as a speedboat running over a lake throws up a wake behind it that you can see, a comet passing through the ether would stir up a wake that would become visible as well. So this was another way to understand this. And then there was the theory of Edmond Halley. So Halley was an amateur astronomer from New York. And he had a very unique theory. His theory is that the comet's head was gaseous and it was shaped like a lens, so like a giant magnifying glass. And the light from the sun went through that gaseous lens and created a beam of light or a beam of concentrated energy, which was the tail. Now, I don't know how many of you misspent your youth and at recess would go out in the afternoons and play with magnifying glasses and burn things, but you know that a magnifying glass can concentrate the sun's energy and produce rather spectacular effects. Halley argued that when Halley's comet passed by us on May 18th, this lens was going to focus energy upon the Earth, and this would set off a lot of problems. Now, Halley didn't believe it was going to scorch the Earth, and his argument was that the gaseous quality of this flying lens, that is the head of the comet, doesn't focus light precisely enough like a lens does. But nevertheless, it will focus energy, and as that energy sweeps across the Earth, it's going to catalyze all sorts of disturbances. So you're going to have geological disturbances, you're going to have climatological changes. He argued that you would have earthquakes because of this energy that's impacting the Earth. You would have volcanic eruptions and major changes in climate. Halley had the good fortune to get very lucky. So shortly after he issued his description in April of 1910 about what was happening or what would happen when this death ray hit us, Mount Etna in Sicily erupted. And it was a particularly violent eruption, and Halley could point to that as, the first piece of evidence supporting the idea that the comet is going to focus its energy beam on us and look out when it happens. Now, I should say that when I was writing this chapter of the book, Mount Etna was erupting. Mount Etna erupts almost every year. It's always erupting. I mean, this goes back to the classical age. It's a very active volcano. But there's also something to be said for just getting lucky when you're making a prediction. This was followed in early May by a massive earthquake in Costa Rica that leveled cities. So again, more evidence to suggest that Halley's energy array might be right on. And then again in May, more rain in France, and the French rivers began to flood as Halley's comet approached. So Halley was looking pretty good at this point, and people again were concerned about this question of what would happen if he was right and a beam of energy swept across the Earth in a very concentrated form on May 18th. And finally, this is the one that was probably, I've saved the best for last because it's the one that really got people nervous. And that was the idea of asphyxiation. What is going to happen to us when we enter the comet's tail? So assuming that it is gaseous, what's that going to be like? What will our experience be? And that brings us back to Camille Flammarion. Now, Flammarion is, as I say here, the French Carl Sagan. And what I mean by that is he was a very gifted professional scientist. So he did a lot of research and published a lot of technical books about astronomy and meteorology. But he was also a gifted popularizer like Sagan was. And so if you remember back to the heyday of Carl Sagan, you couldn't watch any show about, astronomy or the space program without seeing Carl Sagan on there offering his opinion. Of course, Sagan wrote many articles and many popular books, including a book about comets. And Flammarion was the same way. He wrote dozens of books, popular books about astronomy and the things that people were learning at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. He wrote thousands of newspaper and magazine articles. So he was everywhere in the media of his day. If you had pulled somebody off the street in 1910 and said, name an astronomer, 9 people out of 10 probably would have named Camille Flammarion. He was just everywhere, and he was the voice of astronomy and the voice of science for a popular audience. He is also going to be completely destroyed. His reputation will be destroyed thanks to the media, as we're going to see how this plays out. So today, not many people, unless you're a historian of astronomy, remember the guy who was arguably the most famous astronomer of his generation. How did that happen? Well, in the end of November 1909, Camille Flammarion wrote an article for the New York Herald. So the Herald had a big European audience and also an American audience. And he was writing regular updates about the approaching comet. So he's essentially telling people what's going on, what's happening with the comet, what are we looking at right now, kind of periodic updates. And he wrote this piece at the end of November 1909. And after giving a fairly good status report on the condition of the comet, he wrote, from the mechanical, physical, chemical, and thermodynamic viewpoints, we may at once acknowledge that we know nothing of the fate reserved for us next May. The poisoning of humanity by deleterious gases is improbable. Now, I don't know how you feel about this, but I don't like that word improbable. If I'm living in late 1909 and facing this approaching comet, what I want is my scientific expert to say, there's no chance whatsoever we're going to have any problem with this comet. Improbable is a word that makes it sound like, yes, but something could happen. And Flammarion, as we're going to see, doesn't believe anything's going to be happening. He's just exercising, I suppose we could say, proper scientific humility before the unknown. But he doesn't really believe anything is going to happen, and in fact, no serious scientist does. Nevertheless, he indulges himself at this in the next paragraph with a little thought experiment. So it's going to be improbable, but what might it be like if something did happen? Doubtless if, and I'm emphasizing these ifs because these are conditional clauses. If this happened, something could happen, right? If the oxygen of the atmosphere combined with hydrogen of the comet's tail, it would mean universal death with short shrift. If, on the contrary, there resulted a diminution in the supply of nitrogen, the brain of every one of us would experience an unexpected sensation of physical activity, and the human race would come to a sudden end in a paroxysm of joy, universal delirium, and madness at the bottom, probably overjoyed at its fate. So we're going to be gassed, but we'll like it. Carbonic oxide, on the contrary, would cause universal poisoning of the lungs. So here are 3 really bad things that could happen to us if, by some chance, anything was going to happen to us. However, and this was the final paragraph that came right after this one and ended his article, anxious minds have, however, no reason to be tormented uselessly by these prognostications. Comet tails, it is true, are immense, but they are so light, so rarefied, that the terrestrial atmosphere is like lead in comparison. Even were our globe completely plunged into such a tail, we would, without doubt, be saved from a cataclysm by the atmospheric curtain which surrounds us. The comet might be compared to a fog through which a locomotive was dashing at full speed. So Flammarion has run a little thought experiment and said, okay, these are the kind of things that could happen, but, and he concludes, without a doubt, this is not going to happen because we've got this nice thick atmosphere, which is so thick compared to the gaseous diffuse quality of a comet's tail that none of these gases are going to be able to penetrate. Guess which paragraph the newspapers decide to run? The British press jumps on this first. The Manchester Guardian, Monsieur Camille Flammarion, who has been foretelling in the Paris edition of the New York Herald the dreadful things that may happen if the tail of Halley's comet envelopes the Earth next year, has for 30 years made a special study of Mars. Liverpool Press, Daily Post, says basically the same thing. And the Nottingham Post, partial destruction of humanity is possible when we pass through the comet's tail, and the story unwinds from there. What happens in Britain is quickly followed by what happens in America. So the Washington Post picks up the story and runs with it, and again suggests that Flammarion is saying that we're going to die in a delirium of gaseous suffocation. LA Times, the world ends in March approximately. Flammarion prophecy works havoc with the ignorant. Many Europeans take it as gospel truth. Peasants are prodigal. Farmers refuse to sow. The Oakland Tribune, Earth's calamity as prophesied, so on and so forth. In essence, what's going to happen is pretty much most American newspapers are going to pick up this story and run with it. And remember, this is the world's leading astronomer at this point, in at least the popular imagination. He's the one, he's your go-to explainer for what's going on in the skies. And now he's telling you, according to these newspapers, we're all going to die. Very few newspapers run that final paragraph where Flammarion says, this is just a thought experiment, essentially. As you might expect, the middle paragraph is far more interesting. Flammarion tried to fight back and let everybody know that's not really what he said. And this is the most direct statement in February. I would like, first of all, to warn the French and foreign journalists against a temptation to which they have already yielded, that of accusing me of announcing the end of the world for May 19th next. The end of the world will not occur on May 19th next. It doesn't matter. From November right through May, newspapers are going to continuously assert that Flammarion is predicting our end. They assert that he is terrifying people, that he is spreading this idea, and they're relentless. He has no way to stop them from running that sort of story. Things become slightly worse in February. So on February 7th, 1910, astronomers at the Yerkes Observatory are doing spectrography and trying to analyze the component parts of the comet's tail, and they discover that one of those components is cyanogen gas. Now, for those of you who are not chemists, cyanogen gas is a close relative of cyanide. It is extremely toxic. It is used in pesticides, and in its natural state, it has a blue color, and it is said to smell like almonds. So if you smell almonds suddenly, you might be concerned that you're actually getting a dose of cyanogen gas. That discovery is quickly followed by an interview with Professor Edwin Booth, who is a chemist at the University of California, Berkeley, and he is quoted as saying, "If the astronomers are right in their estimations of the amount of cyanogen gas in the tail of Halley's comet, and if that body's vapors do envelope the Earth, we may have a chance to feel the sensations of the bugs and insects which are killed by the use of this deadly gas as an exterminator." Now that is a cheery thought. So not only is the tail coming, not only is it going to sweep the planet, but we now know that it has a deadly gas in it that is used as a pesticide against insects. In 1919, journalist Upton Sinclair wrote a critique of journalism and the media practices of his day. If you've heard of Upton Sinclair, his most famous work is The Jungle, which was an expose of the Chicago meatpacking industry, which was very, very controversial at that time. But in 1919, he turned his own analysis upon his business, which was media. And Sinclair, in this book, The Brass Check, he described the dangers of what he called corporate journalism. So he was very concerned that newspapers, especially magazines to a lesser extent, were profit-making entities. And so they worked for corporate masters, and they were always being pressed to generate income, to make a profit, in other words. How do you do that? Well, you sell newspapers. How do you sell newspapers? you have the most interesting, entertaining, shocking, scandalous stories that you can possibly run. And so when you have, something like an approaching comet, if it's just a boring science story, comet's going to fly through the sky and blah, 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 who cares? But if comet is going to destroy the Earth, that's going to sell a lot of newspapers. So Sinclair identified what he labeled 3 pernicious practices. The first were that journalists routinely misrepresented the ideas and words of their subjects. So again, we can cast our minds back to Father Charapin, and I said he allegedly said this was going to happen, but did he actually say that? The second is they routinely make up stories just out of whole cloth, so they don't even need to attach it to a well-known figure like Father Charapin. They just make things up. And finally, they exaggerate the importance of the stories. So at its base, as I've just hinted a moment ago, the passage of Halley's Comet it's an interesting science story. Does it deserve to be front page news every day, especially in the month of May as it approached and came in? By identifying this and by building up its importance, the newspapers really turned this into a huge story. And as we've already said, the newspapers are the preeminent way that people get their information at this time. And if you're being subjected to a barrage of misleading and demonstrably false stories, it's going to have an effect upon you. So yes, 4 doomsday scenarios, extensive newspaper coverage. I mean, pretty much most newspapers across the country were covering this, especially in May. And it increased the publisher profits. I don't think we can dispute that. So did newspaper readers embrace a Socratic calm when faced with potentially disturbing news or potentially end-of-life situation? Many did, but many did not. And so I want to talk about just a few of the defensive measures that people came up with during this period to try to avoid this certain death in the comet's tail. And the first one I thought was really interesting comes out of Berkeley, California. And this was 3 men, one of whom was a marine engineer, decided they were going to build a submarine. So they were inspired by Jules Verne's classic 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and they decided to quickly whip together a Nautilus. Now the story broke in April, and the comet's going to arrive in May. So it does seem like they didn't have a lot of time to get their ship in order, essentially. But the other problem they ran into was the ship was going to be large enough to carry them and their immediate families and maybe a couple of friends. But when word began to spread that they were building this vessel, this Noah's Ark beneath the sea, many people, of course, wanted to get a ticket aboard that ship. They wanted to be safe from the comet. And when they had to start turning people away in droves, people became so furious with them, why would you take Sam and you won't take me? That ultimately they decided that to end the acrimony in their neighborhood, they would just give up the project. Now, I would say there were practical reasons you would give up the project as well, because I don't think a fully equipped shipyard could throw together a submarine in that, in the period of, say, a month and a half, like they had proposed to do. But nevertheless, this was an early attempt to avoid the gas from the comet. Far more practical was the construction of gas fallout shelters. So we get reports across the country of people who are digging fallout shelters in their backyards. John Marlowe, a farmer from Council Bluffs, Iowa, dug an underground shelter behind his house that would be large enough to shield his family, 2 horses, 2 cows, a dog, a cat, and a number of chickens. And so he's thinking kind of in the Noah's Ark model, keep the family and we'll also take enough livestock with us 2 by 2 to repopulate the Earth after the cyanogen cloud dissipates. The opposite end of the spectrum, Stephen Harder of Pasadena, California, was also digging a fallout shelter, but it was only going to be big enough for him. And so he was going to have enough canned goods to ride out the cyanogen clouds, but not room for anybody else, because basically after the cataclysm, he wanted to be alone and he didn't want to have a lot of other humans cluttering things up. As people's anxieties level rose, there were always people who were willing to prey upon them. And so con artists did a brisk business in the months running up to May 1910. They sold gas masks. And so you could buy a gas mask that would allegedly shield you from the cyanogen gas. There is a story of 2 men in Houston being arrested, and when the police disassembled the gas mask they were selling, they discovered that the filter mechanism was nothing more than dried grass jammed into it. So that probably wouldn't do a very effective job against cyanogen. In Haiti, there was a very famous voodoo doctor who had come up with an anti-cyanogen pill, and he allegedly had a line of people stretched down the block buying these pills, which if you took 2 a day would preserve you when you went through the cyanogen cloud. There are also stories across the country of entrepreneurs who are selling Comet insurance policies. And so there was one man in Los Angeles who would sell you a policy for 50 cents a week. That was your premium you had to pay. And in the event of your death by a comet, and it had to be by a comet, not just fear of a comet, but actual, striking the Earth or a cyanogen cloud, it would pay $500 off to your beneficiaries. And of course, you think in the face of that kind of disaster, who would be around to collect that policy? So it was pretty good business. I think the creative countermeasure I like the most came out of New York, and several saloon operators announced that they had discovered that cyanogen would be dissipated or actually disarmed entirely by the consumption of alcohol. So if you went into your local bar or pub on the night the comet would arrive, and you told the bartender to line up a row of tumblers of scotch and you just sipped slowly through the night, you would be perfectly safe. And that would be the way to ride out the comet. Well, as you might imagine, when you have this sort of media barrage raising concerns, there are going to be a lot of people very susceptible to that. And there were quite a few tragedies that were a direct byproduct of the media coverage of the comet. And so you have cases of temporary insanity. So Fred Bowers of Orville, Ohio was a farmer. And in May, just before, a couple weeks before the comet was due to arrive, he announced that he was not going to pay his bills anymore. So he told all the storekeepers and his suppliers that he wasn't paying his bills. After all, what would be the point? He was just going to spend his money now on him because we're all going to die on May 18th anyway. The police arrested Fred for non-payment of debt. And when he continued to insist that we were all going to die in this comet cloud, they put him in for psychiatric evaluation, and he was carted off to the state mental hospital. A second case was one I called extreme contrition, and this took place in New Jersey. And on the night, on May 18th, the night the comet was passing, Luigi Chiaffici, who was a member of the Italian Black Hand, kind of a local mafia organization, walked into a police station in New Jersey and confessed that he had killed a man named Thomas Cahill. Now, the police were completely caught off guard by this. Cahill had vanished 10 days earlier, but nobody knew what had happened to him. They didn't know if he was alive, if he was dead, if he had just packed up and moved away somewhere. They had no clues whatsoever. It was a complete mystery. Chiaffici walked in and announced that he had killed Thomas Cahill and that he had buried the body in his pig pen. And this is indeed where the police found the corpse of Thomas Cahill. Chiaffici, when questioned by reporters, why did you confess this perfect crime? He said that he knew that we were all going to die on May 18th, and he couldn't face God with this terrible crime on his consciousness. So he wanted to get things right before his inevitable death so that he would have a shot at going to heaven instead of burning in hell forever. So exemplary contrition. And then finally, suicides. So really beginning in the spring of 1910, many people who are, again, hearing a lot about what might happen when this comet comes, decided that it would be far better to take their own lives than to choke to death in a terrible cloud of comet gas. The first person in the United States to do this was a young woman named Ruby Woolfield. who lived in Yakima, Washington. She lived in a small homestead on the Yakima River. And one morning she told her husband to watch her baby, and she was going to go check the mail. An hour passed. Her husband, she hadn't come back. He didn't know where she was. He went outside and looked down to the river. She was standing by the bank. He looked away at something else, and when he turned his attention back to her, she had vanished. Ruby threw herself into the river and drowned. And this was the first comet-related suicide. She left a note saying that she could not bear the idea of this horrible death in the comet's tail. Ruby was the first, but dozens of people followed in the United States and Europe. Again, being very susceptible to the sort of stories that they were hearing and reading in the newspapers. On May 18th, 1910, the Earth passed through the tail of Halley's Comet. It did not harm the planet, as most serious astronomers expected. If you've enjoyed this tale of comet madness, I would encourage you to go visit my website. And if you've really enjoyed it, of course, as Ken mentioned at the beginning of the hour, we do have this fine book, which is available at retailers. You can actually have a link to some of those at the website. And, it makes a fine Christmas gift. Christmas is coming. It's already the Christmas shopping season. So you want to start thinking about that and get ahead of the curve there. Otherwise, I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with you, and I think we can probably throw it open for questions if anybody has any. Let me just stop my sharing.
Well, thank you very much. This is a fascinating discussion of how the popular imagination gets confused. Not that we've seen this in our own lifetime at all. But comparing the dates, I realized that the 60-inch telescope at Mount Wilson was in operation, and truly George Ritchie, who was still working there before he'd been fired, did capture a pretty spectacular image of the head of the comet with a 60-inch telescope. But there's no mention of Mount Wilson doing any spectroscopy, as you cited Yerkes. Just kind of a curious. Seems like an obvious thing for an observatory to want to do.
Yeah, I cannot speak to what Mount Wilson was doing. I'm sorry at that point.
Yeah.
Going back to there we go. Okay, good.
This is so reminiscent, and while you were speaking, Dr. Goodrich, of Halloween night and Orson Welles and his players putting together his War of the Worlds presentation over the radio, and having very similar circumstances with people panicking and suicides because they all thought that our planet was being invaded by Martians. And so, hearing and seeing the effects of another or a celestial body just, speaks to the panic and inhumanity. I think that's going to happen when something as obviously atrocious or visible of having a comet or a planetary body or God knows what else. We watch enough sci-fi to really just fill in the blank, and to know that we're going to go down in flames because people will be so terrified that they're just going to go down to their base nature to try and survive for as long as they can.
Yes, and I think one of the things that really struck me, and I thought about Orson Welles' presentation, is on the day after the newspapers had a fit. And again, this is their opportunity to attack radio, which has now become a prime competitor for people's attention. But how could you be so irresponsible to publish these sorts of stories when, of course, this is what they've been doing basically as long as newspapers have existed?
And granted, they did have opportunities to put in like a commercial or to identify this is simply a radio play, it's blah, 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 blah. But of course, when you're already past that, and you're doing the presentation, you know, you don't have the ability to go, oh, I wonder if this is just a play, or if this is just a serial, or if this is real. And as you pointed out, and this is in the 1920s, I think, 30s, whatever it was, very
30s,
early
I believe.
30s.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
You can't blame people for responding in that manner. And yeah, the day after, they got so much crap about being irresponsible, and everybody got dinged, and it was like, well, it was just a play anyhow. But yeah, it was quite fascinating reading about that as well. This is just right up there with what might be a pretty good portent of the behavior of just normal everyday people when something extraordinary happens.
It is. And the other thing that what you just said reminds me of is the day after Halley's Comet passed, and what was the lead story in most newspapers? How the scientists deceived us, basically. So the scientists had misled the entire world in saying that this was a threat, when of course the scientists all along are saying, no, it's not a threat, and the newspapers are making this up. But yes.
Well, they had to blame somebody, didn't they?
Well, they couldn't blame themselves.
Of course not.
No.
So in terms of the original proposition, either extreme devout religious observances or some form of madness, it looks like the needle maybe was in the middle with the tilt toward the madness.
Yes, and it's kind of interesting because there were reports all across the country of revivalism, and so the churches were full. And they said, Chicago Tribune wrote about churches and synagogues that are standing room only on this night. On the other hand, you had people camping out in the parks hoping to see the tail come flying past, and some amazing display. So it's kind of, people gravitated towards both ends of the spectrum on how to deal with this.
Well, I'm just hoping that if we do see a comet tail go by us, that it's not going to turn into the day of the Triffids, where we all go blind or something.
Well, I have a whole series of old astrophysical journals and actually Palomar Observatory was disbanding one of their libraries, and they offered them up for grabs. And so I was sort of interested in historic ones about the time of World War I, say 1914, and through the war. But the interesting thing is these, of course, this isn't the popular press. This is the professional journals. But nonetheless, these people are very objective, and we know famous names like Chandra Scalar and George Hale and others are writing learned articles just like they would be today. So there was a huge amount of technical knowledge, and they knew how to calculate orbits because Messier, the comet hunter at the time of the French Revolution, they could work out orbits reasonably quickly, I believe. So it is kind of fascinating that there's a huge body of accurate technical information that somehow doesn't make it into the popular press. It's almost like reading Popular Mechanics.
Yes, well, the problem is scientific knowledge is not necessarily always that fascinating. And sorry, that I didn't mean it that way. But the idea that the comet's not going to do anything to us is far more boring than the idea that we might all die in the comet. And if you're a newspaper editor, which story you're going to run. Yes. And in fact, one of the things that they tend to do, especially the larger and more reputable ones, is they will give you a very wild story like Father Charpin says this is going to happen, and then they will place kind of a counterpoint. But this astronomer says no, that's not going to happen. But the fact is, they're still not. I mean, they're kind of leaning towards the more serious interpretation, but they're not taking away the completely fallacious interpretation as well. And so, just by running that, there is some responsibility, I think, for spreading these ideas that we're all going to die.
The false equivalency.
Hmm.
I have a, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I had a question for Dr. Goodrich. In the 1758 apparition, which was predicted by Halley, was there any indication that in your history, your research, that showed that there were similar harbors of doom regarding that appearance?
No, and I think that's, I mean, this is
It's an
in the book referred to Halley as actually being like Prometheus and stealing comets from the gods, because prior to him, comets are basically universally around the globe are regarded as messengers from the gods. And Halley's prediction of the return of the comet and essentially establishing the idea that this is just a natural phenomenon and has nothing to do with the intervention or messages from the gods was rather revolutionary. There were, however, having said that, there are still popular preachers who are writing books about the appearance of comets, even well after Halley, after a successful prediction, as a message from God that, you know, the end times are near. So that doesn't go away quickly. In 1835, there is some panic around Chicago about the comet, but generally I think the idea is starting to seep in that comets are not, they are a natural phenomenon by the mid-19th century.
Until 1910.
Mhm. Yeah, well, at this point, we know that it's not being sent by the gods, but it's still going to gas us.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So I do have a question.
Mhm.
Sort of, if there was a heavenly body coming towards the earth, and say one of the governments on our planet knew that it was going to happen, I guess the $65 question is, should we be informed overall as a planet, or should that information be held so that we would prevent having like I said, the insanity, the craziness, the lack of humanity that would be forthcoming when we realize that we're going to be dead in about 2 days? Should that information be held from us, do you think, in your opinion?
Well, I'm not a policy advisor, but if it was me, I think I would hold it. The worst thing is that you're going to have to go before the House of Representatives and justify your behavior, but you're going to be dead anyway, so it doesn't really matter at that stage. And if there was nothing you could do about it, if there's something you could do about it, I think you would want to inform the people. But if there's nothing you could do about it, I guess I don't see the point in a global panic at that stage.
Of course, it would become visible.
Well, there is that problem.
Just like
Yes.
and
Right.
see this thing that's the size of a dish in the sky.
Yeah, I don't think you could keep it under wraps forever, but maybe as long as possible.
By that time it'd be, like you said, way too late, because now it's pretty obvious what's going to happen. But in the meantime, though, you'd have other amateurs talking to other amateurs, trying to corroborate someone's observations and their data, because obviously we're turning, so the other side of the planet, can have the same, hopefully understanding what's going on anyway. But yeah, I don't think I'd want to know, honestly, until it's right upon us. I'm thinking of War of the World, not War of the Worlds. What's the other one? When Worlds Collide, I guess. Once it's there, there's not much you can do about it. Just ride the storm, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just me.
I was thinking of on the beach, and there's the same kind of scenario, and the subject just stoically goes out to meet his fate in the most noble fashion possible.
Well, that was going back to San Francisco or wherever the heck they were going because they're Americans. I'm sorry, that's because I just saw this movie here about 3 weeks ago. It's funny you mentioned it. And the book was really quite good too, but the same kind of premise. How do you face the end of the world?
Probably walk into a New York bar and line up the tumblers of scotch.
Knowing SDAA, I think we're all going to in favor of that
We're gonna
solution.
be outside.
Go out there, TDS, and set up some beer.
There you go.
There
We
you
do
go.
have some beer connoisseurs out there.
Hmm.
Or buy that $35,000 bottle of brandy that's over at Costco that I saw a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and,
Yeah,
and put
'cause
it on your put it on your credit card.
There you go. I'm not paying for it.
Let me ask though, Halley's is such a recognizable periodic comet, and it's always been fairly visible and prominent. And there was another a large comet in 1910. In the same time frame, from 1835 to 1910 or thereabouts, were there other large periodic comets that that show the same characteristics? I mean, or was Halley the one that got people's attention and jitters?
I'm trying to remember now. There's in the late 19th century, there's a comet. I want to say it's around 1860, in the 1860s, and we flew through the tail. And the astronomers at that point, I mean, we didn't know we were going to fly through the tail, so it caught everybody a bit off guard. But the astronomers who were trying to diffuse this idea of asphyxiation said, well, this has happened before. It's not the first time the Earth has flown through the tail. So there were several large comets, and even in the beginning of the 20th century. But I think Halley's Comet has a mystique about it. And, going through history, you can tie it to all sorts of events like the 1066 Norman invasion of England and the Turkish invasion of Europe in 1454. And so there's kind of a special quality about it that makes it stand out, as opposed to other comets. That's why I'm sure all of you remember that 1986 appearance of Halley's Comet, which was a bit of a fizzle, I think. And I remember wanting to see that and thinking, this is the great comet, that has lit up the heavens and caused so much unease amongst civilizations. But yeah, that was kind of a disappointment, I must say. 2061, maybe it'll be better.
Yeah.
I'll try to be around for that.
I knew somebody would say that.
Yes,
Somebody would calculate their lifespan.
I'm not feeling my chances are good, but it'd be worth something. I should say that at this point, there were also a lot of people who had been around in 1835 and were still alive in 1910 and were old enough to remember it from 1835. So there were members of the Two Comet Club. Mark Twain himself was born in 1835 and he died in 1910. But so he was still a baby during the first pass. But in 1909, he told his biographer that he had been born in the year that Halley's Comet arrived, and he expected to die in the year that Halley's Comet returned. And he was absolutely right. So he died in April of 1910. I guess my point, I got off track there. My point is, it is possible to see it twice.
It is possible.
If you hit your dates right, if you arrange your birth properly.
Yes. 75 years, that's tough span. Any more questions? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Goodrich, for giving us this talk. This was fascinating. This is an aspect of astronomy we don't normally encounter because we're kind of off the deep end in terms of the science, and you don't quite realize always the phasing of key bits of knowledge. For example, we didn't really know how stars shined until 1938 and Hans Bethe, and the size of the universe with Hubble, and the 100-inch at Mount Wilson. So all these things that are common knowledge today, really really have occurred, since after the 1910 occurrence of Halley's Comet.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed meeting you and speaking with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and thank you for getting up so early.
No problem.
Well, thank you all for attending. This concludes the meeting, and we'll see you again next month for a discussion of what we learned from the lunar landings. So until then, see you at a star party or the AC meeting next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Ken. That was a good topic. That was fun to have.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
You don't think
yeah.
about, yeah.
Cool. Thanks again.